February 27th, 1881, the summit of Majuba Hill, South Africa. The air is thin, the light sharp. Below, the rocky grasslands of the Transvaal stretch out, deceptively peaceful. On this exposed, isolated peak stand roughly 400 men of the British Army. They are a mix of regulars, including the 92nd Gordon Highlanders, men who represent the absolute pinnacle of an imperial fighting machine that has dominated the globe for 2 centuries. They are commanded by Sir George Pomeroy Colley, a general who believes, as all his predecessors did, in the inevitable, almost divine power of the British regular. And, like all those predecessors, his men are clad in the most iconic uniform in military history, the red coat. But something is lethally wrong. There is no opposing army arrayed in the valley below. There are no massed columns to shatter with volley fire, no cavalry to form square against. Instead, hidden in the scrub and rocks, are perhaps 150, perhaps 300 Boer marksmen. They are not soldiers. They are farmers, frontiersmen, clad in their drab civilian clothes, and they are armed with modern, accurate, breech-loading rifles. They are fighting a new kind of war, and the red coat, the very symbol of British power, has become a beacon. It is a target, visible from a mile away. The battle, if it can be called that, is not a clash of lines. It is a systematic execution. The crack of individual rifles, not the massed crash of a volley, echoes up the slopes. There is no thick, sulphurous smoke from black powder to obscure the battlefield. The Boers are using new, smokeless propellants. They can see their targets perfectly. The British, advancing and manoeuvring in their traditional formations, are mown down. The red wool, so famous for masking the sight of blood from a man's comrades, is now soaked in it. Officers, distinguished by their cochineal scarlet and bright swords, are picked off first. The 92nd Highlanders, men of incredible bravery, try to mount bayonet charges into the empty landscape, only to be dropped one by an invisible enemy. General Colley himself, the architect of this disaster, is shot in the head. The British force, the inheritor of Wellington's legacy, breaks. The survivors tumble and flee down the hill, hunted by the accurate Boer fire. It is an unmitigated catastrophe, a humiliation, but it is more than a single defeat. Majuba Hill is a tombstone. It marks the precise, bloody end of an era. The 200-year reign of the Redcoat, the system of tactics, discipline, and technology it represented, has been proven lethally obsolete. To understand the power this uniform held, to grasp how it became a psychological weapon that forged an empire, we must understand why it was ever worn at all. Why, in an age of gunpowder, did an army choose to dress its men in the brightest, most conspicuous colour imaginable? The answer lies not in a flash of tactical genius, but in an iron-willed revolution that, in 1645, created the most disciplined military force the world had ever seen. The story of the Redcoat begins not as a weapon, but as a tool of logistics, economics, and iron-fisted control. Before 1645, war in England, as in most of Europe, was a chaotic and often seasonal affair. Armies were raised, not maintained. They were patchwork things, assembled by aristocrats who equipped their tenants in their own livery, creating a battlefield that resembled a garish, deadly pageant more than a unified military force. Discipline was poor, logistics were an afterthought, and allegiance was often temporary. The English Civil War began in this very fashion, a clash of militias and private levies. But one man, a plain, iron-willed parliamentarian named Oliver Cromwell, saw that this gentlemanly, amateurish approach to bloodshed was failing. He sought something new, something efficient, something terrible. Cromwell's vision, which would be formalized as the New Model Army, in 1645, was nothing short of a revolution. It was to be a professional force, a standing army beholden not to a local lord or county, but to the state. Soldiers would be paid regularly, promoted on merit, not bloodline, and subjected to rigorous, relentless drill. This was the birth of the modern military professional. But with this professionalism came a profound logistical problem: how to clothe, identify, and control tens of thousands of men. The answer was the uniform. And the uniform, for reasons of pure pragmatism, was to be red. The choice had nothing to do with psychology, camouflage, or battlefield theory. It was a matter of economics. The cheapest, most durable, and most readily available dye on the market was madder. This humble plant root, when processed, produced a dull brick red known as Venetian Red A. It was colour-fast, it was robust, and most importantly, it could be sourced in industrial quantities to clothe the entire army for the first time in English history. This standardization was the real innovation. While officers might still wear their own, more expensive scarlet coats dyed with cochineal, the rank and file, the backbone of this new army, were unified by the colour of madder. The effect was immediate and profound. On the 17th century battlefield, a chaotic mess of pikes and muskets, the red coat became a tool of order. In the swirling, acrid, white-grey smoke of black powder, a commander could, for the first time, look across the field and clearly distinguish his formations. It was the beginning of true command and control. But the psychological effect on the soldiers themselves was just as important. The uniform was an initiation. It stripped a man of his regional identity, his past as a farmer or a craftsman, and reforged him. He was no longer a Yorkshireman or a Londoner. He was a soldier. The red coat was a social leveller, the symbol of a new, shared identity, an esprit de corps built on discipline, Puritan ideology, and the shared experience of the drill. When this new model army met the colourfully clad aristocratic cavalier forces of King Charles, the contrast was terrifying. The royalists saw not a rabble, but a relentless mechanical force, advancing in disciplined blocks of red, firing in unison, and standing their ground. The red coat had become the symbol of this new, terrifying professionalism. It was born of logistics, but it would be honed on the battlefields of Europe into a true weapon system. The man who would perfect it, who would take Cromwell's disciplined infantry and turn them into the most dominant force of the next century, was a military genius named John Churchill. The 18th century dawned with a new kind of warfare, and its master was John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. If Cromwell forged the redcoat into a disciplined body, Marlborough tempered it into a precision blade. He inherited the professional new model army and combined it with a new, revolutionary piece of technology that would define the next 100 years of war, the socket bayonet. Before this innovation, armies were a clumsy mix of musketeers for firepower and pikemen for protection against cavalry. The plug bayonet, an earlier attempt, was a failure. It literally plugged the musket barrel, turning a ranged weapon into a useless spear. But the socket bayonet changed everything. It was a triangular blade on a metal tube that fit around the barrel, locking into place. Suddenly, the musketeer and the pikeman were one and the same. Every single red-coated infantryman was now a hybrid soldier, a spearman and a gunner, able to fire his musket and defend himself from a cavalry charge, and press an attack home with cold steel, all without changing his weapon. This single invention was the key that unlocked the most dominant tactical formation of the age. Linear tactics. Marlborough, a genius of organisation and manoeuvre, saw its potential immediately. He drilled his redcoats, already the most disciplined soldiers in Europe, to fight in long, tight lines, often 3 ranks deep. This formation maximised the firepower of the Brown Bess land pattern musket. The Brown Bess itself was not an accurate weapon. It was a .75 caliber, smooth bore, flintlock musket, and hitting a single man beyond 80 yards was a matter of pure luck. But that was never the point. The Brown Bess was designed for volume. It was a durable, reliable wall of lead delivery system. Marlborough's genius was in the drill. His redcoats were trained to reload and fire with a mechanical, relentless speed, 3 rounds per minute. The process was a ballet of precise movements, hammered into them on the parade ground. Click-clack went the steel ramrod pushing the cartridge down the barrel. Teeth tore the paper cartridge, The snap of the flintlock was followed by the deafening, simultaneous crash of a volley. This system was unveiled in all its terrible glory on the banks of the Danube on August 13, 1704, at the Battle of Blenheim. Here, Marlborough's Anglo-Dutch-Austrian army faced a massive Franco-Bavarian force. The French were confident, their own infantry considered the best in Europe. But they had never faced Marlborough's Red Line. The British infantry advanced with an impossible, unnerving steadiness, their red coats a stark, moving wall against the green fields. They marched through artillery fire, closing the gap. They held their fire, a testament to their iron discipline, while the French unleashed ragged, ineffective volleys at a distance. Then, at point-blank range, the order was given. The crash of the British volleys, fired as one, tore the heart out of the French formations. The wall of lead worked, but the system had two parts. As the French line staggered, reeling from the shock, Marlborough unleashed the second part of the equation. The order came: fix bayonets. The British line bristled with steel and with a cheer charged into the smoke. This 1-2 punch, the devastating volley followed by the immediate brutal bayonet charge, was unstoppable. It broke the will of the French. Blenheim was a stunning, decisive victory. It proved that the British Redcoat, armed with his brown bess and socket bayonet and drilled to perfection in linear tactics, was the new master of the European battlefield. The age of British military dominance had begun. Marlborough's victories had set the standard. For the next 50 years, the British Redcoat became the most feared and respected infantryman in the world. The system was exported globally as the British Empire expanded. This expansion inevitably led to a climactic global confrontation with its primary rival, France. This was the 7 Years' War, a conflict fought on the fields of Europe, the plains of India, and, most critically, in the vast wild forests of North America. Here, the Redcoat, a soldier drilled for the open battlefields of Europe, was forced to adapt. But at the war's decisive moment, it was not adaptation that won the day, but a perfect, terrifying execution of the very system Marlborough had perfected. The date is September 13th, 1759. The place, a flat, grassy expanse outside the fortress of Quebec, known as the Plains of Abraham. After a masterful and audacious amphibious landing, scaling the cliffs under cover of darkness, General James Wolfe has done the impossible. He has manoeuvred his army of 4,800 British regulars onto the doorstep of the capital of New France. Wolfe is the very archetype of the 18th century British officer. Aggressive, meticulous, and a fanatic for drill and discipline. He knows his men, he knows his system, and he is about to stake the future of a continent on it. The French commander, Montcalm, is stunned to find a British army formed in perfect battle array outside his fortress. He scrapes together his own force of 4,500 French regulars and Canadian militia and advances to meet them. The French, advancing in columns, begin to fire at a distance, their volleys ragged and ineffective. The British line, by contrast, is silent. It is a long, thin, too deep line of red. Wolfe has thinned his formation from the traditional 3 ranks to 2, a dangerous gamble that extends his frontage but makes his line more brittle. It is a supreme vote of confidence in his men's discipline. Wolfe rides along the line, his commands audible in the tense quiet, ordering his men to hold their fire. They are to load their muskets, their Brown Bess muskets, with 2 balls for maximum shock. They stand motionless, a 3,000-foot wall of red, as the French close the distance. 100 yards, 80 yards. The French stop, fire another ragged volley, and resume their advance. The British line does not flinch. 60 yards, 40 yards. The French columns are now at point-blank range, close enough for the British to see the whites of their eyes. Then, the order. A single crash rips the air as 4,800 muskets from the 43rd and 47th Foot and others fire as one. The sound is not a rattle, but a single, massive explosion, a wall of lead that atomizes the front ranks of the French columns. The air is instantly choked with the familiar, acrid, white-grey smoke of black powder. The French, who had been advancing with élan, are stopped cold. They are shattered, their formations dissolved into a panicked mob. Before they can even comprehend the shock, the British order comes: "Fix bayonets! Charge!" Through the smoke, the Red Line, now bristling with 17 inches of steel, surges forward. The battle is over in minutes. The French army is routed, Quebec falls, and with it, New France. Wolfe himself is killed, but his thin red line, a tactic built on the foundation of the socket bayonet, the brown bess, and above all, the inhuman discipline of the Redcoat, had just conquered a continent. The victory at Quebec was a testament to the sheer power of disciplined firepower. As the 18th century progressed, the British Army standardized this system. The red coat itself became more than just a uniform. It evolved into a sophisticated tool for battlefield management. On a field choked with the impenetrable wall of acrid, sulphurous smoke from black powder, the red coat was a beacon. It was, quite simply, the only way a general could see his army. But as the army grew, it needed more granular control. This led to the standardization of regimental facings. The facings, the colours of the cuffs, collars and lapels, became a regimental fingerprint. A general scanning the chaos of battle could, at a glance, identify his units. He would look for the 1st Foot Guard's royal blue, the 3rd Foot's buff, or the 5th Foot's bright green. These flashes of colour, set against the sea of red, were the primary instruments of command and control. High above the smoke, the 8-foot-tall regimental colours, or flags, served as the rallying points, the pivots for manoeuvre. The entire system was designed for visibility in a low-visibility environment. The red coat wasn't hiding from anyone. It was broadcasting its position, its identity, and its unbreakable confidence to both its commander and its enemy. This system, so perfectly honed in the 18th century, was about to face its greatest test. A revolution in France had unleashed a new kind of warfare. Napoleon Bonaparte had forged a nation in arms, an army of conscripts driven by patriotic fervour, moving in massive shock columns. This was a different beast from the aristocratic, deliberate armies Marlborough had faced. The French colonne d'attaque was a battering ram, a deep formation of men, hundreds strong, designed to march at the enemy line and punch through it with sheer weight of numbers and élan. Against this new, brutal tactic, the thin red lines of Europe buckled and broke. All, that is, except one. Enter Arthur Wellesley, the 1st Duke of Wellington. He was not a romantic. He was a cold, practical and brilliant Anglo-Irish aristocrat, a master of the defensive battle. He understood the Napoleonic system and he engineered the perfect counter. He knew his redcoats, drilled in the 3 rounds a minute volley, were the best infantry in the world, if he could protect them. And so, in the long grinding Peninsular War in Spain and Portugal, he perfected his signature tactic, the blind reverse slope. Wellington would position his main line of infantry just behind the crest of a hill, hiding them from the enemy's view. The French, advancing up the slope, could only see a light screen of British skirmishers, often the green-jacketed 95th Rifles, who would harass them and then fall back. The French columns, believing the main line was weak, would surge forward, drums beating, shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" They would reach the crest of the hill, disorganized and breathless from the climb, only to be met by a horrifying surprise. There, just yards away, stood the British infantry, a 2-deep line of redcoats, silent, steady, and with muskets levelled. Wellington had refined Wolfe's 2-deep line, sacrificing shock for the absolute maximum amount of firepower. The French column, deep but with only a narrow front, could only bring a fraction of its muskets to bear. The British line, by contrast, could fire every single gun. The resulting volley, at point-blank range, was an act of annihilation. It blew the head off the column, stopping it dead. And as the survivors staggered in the smoke, the order came. "Fix bayonets! Charge!" The redcoats, pouring over the crest, would slam into the disorganized mass, turning the attack into a rout. This was the system that would bring Napoleon to his knees. June 18th, 1815. A muddy ridge near a Belgian village named Waterloo. This is the culmination, the final, desperate gamble. Napoleon Bonaparte, returned from exile, has raised a new army of 73,000 veterans, and he is now hurling it at the last Allied army in his way, a mixed force of British, Dutch and German troops, 25,000 of whom are British Redcoats, all under the command of Wellington. The very man who perfected the Redcoats' defensive tactics. Wellington has chosen his ground perfectly. He is deployed on a reverse slope, just as he had done so many times in Spain. But Napoleon is not his Spanish marshals. He is the god of war, and he intends to smash Wellington's line with the greatest concentration of force the world had ever seen. The battle opens with a monstrous artillery bombardment. The sound is a physical concussion, a continuous, deafening roar of cannons that shakes the ground. Wellington's men, lying down on the reverse slope, are partially protected, but the air is filled with the high-pitched, demonic whir of cannonballs, which tear through the air and strike the earth with sickening, wet thuds. The British line holds, a testament to their hardened discipline. Then Napoleon commits his infantry. Tens of thousands of French infantry, advancing in massive columns, march up the slope. Wellington waits. He lets them crest the ridge, lets them see the red line, and then, from just 50 yards, his infantry stands up and unleashes the volley. The crash of thousands of Brown Bess muskets, firing as one, rips the front from the French columns. The familiar bayonet charge follows. The French are repulsed, time and again, but Napoleon is furious. He sees Wellington's line wavering, and he decides to break it not with infantry, but with the most feared weapon on the Napoleonic battlefield, the massed heavy cavalry. Thousands of French cuirassiers, iron men in steel breastplates, begin to move. For any other army in Europe, this would be the end. A line of infantry, no matter how disciplined, cannot stand against a charging mass of thousands of horses. But Wellington and the Redcoats have an answer. The command rings out along the ridge, passed by officers and bellowed by sergeants. Form square! This is the second and perhaps more critical formation of the Redcoat system, the infantry square. It is not a tactic of aggression, but of pure, stubborn survival. The Redcoats, drilled for this moment, move with mechanical precision. Their battalions, perhaps 500 men, rapidly form a hollow four-sided box, a hedgehog of men and steel. The front rank kneels, their Brown Bess muskets held at an angle, the socket bayonets pointing up and out, a thicket of deadly spikes. The ranks behind them stand, muskets levelled, ready to fire. The regimental colours are moved to the centre for protection, a rallying point in the chaos. The French cavalry thunders up the slope. They are a tidal wave of steel and horseflesh. They crash against the squares, the horses rearing up, refusing to impale themselves on the wall of bayonets. The Redcoats, their faces grim, stand firm. They do not run. They do not break. The rear ranks of the square begin to fire, a rolling, disciplined series of volleys that empties saddles and brings down horses. The sound is a cacophony. The snap of flintlocks, the shouts of men, the screaming of horses, and the clang of steel on steel. For hours, this scene repeats. The French cavalry surges, flows around the red-coated, smoke-wreathed islands, and then ebbs, leaving a horrific tide of dead and dying men and animals around them. The Redcoat, in his square formation, has proven unbreakable. He has neutralized the most powerful shock weapon of the age. Waterloo is the peak. It is the absolute, unquestioned, and final triumph of the Redcoat system, the perfect synthesis of the two-deep line for firepower and the infantry square for defense, all built on a foundation of inhuman discipline. The victory at Waterloo cemented the Redcoats' legend. For the next 4 decades, the British Army was the undisputed master of conventional warfare, an imperial police force that projected its power from India to Africa. The red-coated line and the unbreakable square were articles of faith, a tactical doctrine set in stone, proven by the defeat of the greatest military genius of the age. But even as this legend was being celebrated, the very technology that underpinned it was rotting from within. The entire system, the dense lines, the 3 rounds a minute drill, the 80-yard volley, was built around the limitations of the Howe Brown Bess musket. And in the 1850s, the Brown Bess was replaced. The new weapon was the Patton 1853 Enfield rifle musket. On the outside, it looked similar. It was a single-shot, muzzle-loading weapon. But on the inside, it was a revolutionary leap. Unlike the smoothbore Brown Bess, the Enfield's barrel was rifled, cut with spiral grooves, and instead of a loose-fitting round ball, it fired a conical Menier bullet, which was designed to expand upon firing, grip the rifling, and spin. This spin acted like a gyroscope, stabilizing the bullet in flight. The result was a weapon that was not just accurate at 80 yards, but lethally, predictably accurate out to 500 yards and more. The British Army had, almost overnight, increased the effective range of its infantry by a factor of 6. This was a paradigm shift. An army of riflemen could, in theory, destroy an advancing enemy before they ever got close enough to fire their own muskets. But the British High Command, steeped in the traditions of Wellington, failed to grasp the implications. They adopted this new sniper-like weapon, but kept the old close-order tactics. They kept the dense formations, and most fatefully, they kept the bright red coats. They had given a marksman's tool to soldiers still trained to fight like a medieval phalanx. The first, dramatic, and deeply misunderstood test of this new, contradictory system came in the Pyrenees, Crimean War, October 25th, 1854, near the port of Balaclava. A massive force of 2,500 Russian cavalry is sweeping across the plain, routing Allied Turkish units and heading straight for the critical British supply base. The only thing standing in their way is a single isolated infantry regiment, the 93rd Sutherland Highlanders, numbering approximately 550 men. Their commander, Sir Colin Campbell, is a man of Wellington's school, a believer in iron discipline. As the wave of Russian cavalry thundered towards them, the correct, textbook-approved tactic was obvious. Form square. Campbell did not form a square. In a moment of supreme, almost reckless confidence, he kept his men in their standard 2-deep battle line. A line of infantry had never, in the history of warfare, stood and defeated a full-scale cavalry charge. It was suicide. The correspondent for the Times newspaper, watching from a nearby hill, famously described the scene. There was no more advance from the Russians. They saw that thin red streak tipped with a line of steel and fled. This was the thin red line. It instantly became a symbol of British invincibility. But it was not just courage that won the day. It was the Enfield rifle. The 93rd were armed with the new P1853. They didn't wait for the Russians to get to 80 yards. They opened fire at extreme range, their volleys tearing holes in the charging ranks. They fired again and again, reloading with the same mechanical drill. But this time their bullets were not a generalized wall of lead. They were accurate, spinning projectiles, each one finding a mark. The Russian cavalry, which had expected to be on top of the infantry before they could fire more than once, was shattered by firepower alone. The charge broke and fled. The thin red line had held. It was hailed as the ultimate vindication of the Redcoats' discipline. But it was, in fact, a terrifying prophecy. It proved that infantry firepower was now so lethal that the age of close-order charges was over. And if 550 rifles could do this to cavalry, what would happen when 2 lines of rifle-armed infantry, both wearing bright red targets, stood 500 yards apart? The triumph at Balaclava was, in hindsight, a warning. But it was a warning that the British Army, at the zenith of its imperial power, chose to ignore. The thin red line became mythology, proof of the Redcoats' moral, not just tactical superiority. For the next 3 decades, the army continued its work as a global police force, fighting colonial wars where its discipline and firepower, now augmented by the Enfield rifle, remained decisive. In places like India and Africa, they often faced brave, massed charges, exactly the kind of old war that the Redcoat system was designed to annihilate. The legend of British invincibility only grew, but this confidence was built on a dangerously outdated foundation. The world, and the technology of killing, was changing faster than the army's doctrine. While the British soldier was still forced to stand in a dense line to reload his muzzle-loading rifle with a ramrod, European and American gunsmiths had perfected the breech-loading rifle. A man with a breech loader could lie prone, behind cover, and reload simply by working a lever or a bolt. He could fire 5, even 10, accurate shots in the time it took a Redcoat to fire his 3 standing, exposed rounds. Furthermore, new chemical propellants were being developed. Smokeless powder. This was perhaps the most critical change of all. For 2 centuries, the Redcoat's primary battlefield function was identification. In the impenetrable white-grey fog of black powder, the bright colour was a vital tool of command and control. But smokeless powder changed the equation entirely. Suddenly, the battlefield was clear. The smoke that had once masked the lines of red was gone. And in a new age of accurate, long-range, rapid-firing rifles, the Redcoat, once a tactical asset, had become a fatal, glaring liability. It was a target. This new, lethal reality was about to be demonstrated with brutal clarity in, of all places, South Africa. The opponents were not a European army or a tribal levy. They were the Boers, Dutch-descended farmers and frontiersmen of the Transvaal. They were not soldiers, and that was precisely what made them so dangerous. They were a civilian militia of marksmen. They had grown up in a harsh land, living in the saddle, their rifle a tool for hunting and survival. They did not fight in lines or columns. They had no regimental colours, no drums, and no interest in the gentlemanly art of the volley and the bayonet charge. They practiced what the British dismissed as skulking, what we now call guerrilla tactics. They wore their drab, earth-toned farm clothes for camouflage. They fought as individuals from cover, taking aimed, deliberate shots. And they were armed with modern breech-loading rifles. In 1880, the Boers of the Transvaal declared independence, igniting the First Boer War. The British government dispatched a small field force under the command of Sir George Pomeroy Colley. Colley was a product of the British system, brave, educated, and utterly convinced of the superiority of the British regular. He held the Boers in contempt, viewing them as a disorganised rabble. He believed that the mere sight of his disciplined redcoats, advancing with the bayonet, would be enough to send them running. He was about to march the 18th century tactics of Marlborough directly into the guns of the 20th century, the climax of Colley's disastrous campaign, and the final, bloody sermon for the Redcoat era, came on the night of February 26, 1881. In a bold, perhaps arrogant night march, Sir George Pomeroy Colley led a force of approximately 400 British regulars to seize the summit of Majuba Hill. His force was a mix of regiments, including the seasoned 92nd Gordon Highlanders. From this high, flat-topped mountain, Colley believed he could dominate the surrounding terrain and the Boer positions. As dawn broke on the 27th, the British stood on the summit, silhouetted against the bright morning sky. They could see the Boer lagers, or camps, far below. In their bright red coats, they were, in turn, visible for miles, a perfect, arrogant expression of imperial power. Down below, the Boers were initially dismayed. But their leaders saw not an impregnable fortress, but a trapped, exposed target. Small groups of Boer marksmen, perhaps 150, perhaps as many as 300, began the ascent. They did not march in columns. They did not unfurl flags or beat drums. They moved as hunters, using every fold in the ground, every rock, every patch of scrub for cover. They were clad in their earth-toned clothes, blending perfectly with the rocky grassland. This was their land. They knew how to move through it. On the summit, the British waited in their traditional formations. They established a perimeter, the red-coated soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, their confidence absolute. They were the men of Balaclava and Waterloo. They had their Enfields, they had their bayonets, and they had their discipline. They peered down the slopes, waiting for the rabble to show itself. The first shots were a surprise. They were not the massed crash of a volley, but the sharp individual crack of a single, well-aimed rifle. A man would grunt and fall, then another. The British, unable to see their enemy, responded in the only way they knew how. They fired volleys into the landscape. The sound of their massed fire was impressive, but it hit nothing. And in the clear, smokeless air, the white-grey smoke of their own black powder rifles instantly gave away their exact positions, a plume of smoke for the Boer riflemen to target. The Boers, by contrast, were all but invisible. They crawled closer, their breech-loading rifles allowing them to fire, reload, and fire again, all from the safety of a prone, concealed position. For the British, the battle was an exercise in pure, agonizing futility. Their 18th century tactics were useless. To fire their muzzle-loaders, they had to stand up, exposing their entire bodies, their red coats a perfect aiming point against the sky. To fix bayonets and charge was impossible. There was no one to charge. The 92nd Highlanders, men of legendary courage, attempted it, only to be dropped one by an enemy they never saw. It was a systematic, clinical execution. The red coat, the symbol of discipline, was now a death shroud. It prevented camouflage, it signalled a target, and it broadcasted rank. The Boer marksmen, true to their pragmatic creed, targeted the officers first, easy to spot in their finer cochineal scarlet and carrying swords. As the officers fell, the British command structure, so rigid and hierarchical, dissolved. Men clustered in small groups, confused, terrified, and being shot to pieces. General Colley himself, the man who had so fatefully underestimated his enemy, was shot in the head. At that, the British line, the heir to the thin red line, shattered. It was not a retreat. It was a rout. The survivors fled, tumbling and running down the steep slopes, hunted every step of the way by the accurate, relentless fire of the invisible Boer farmers. The Redcoat, as a system of war, had died on that hill. The news of Majuba Hill struck Britain like a thunderclap. It was more than a defeat. It was an incomprehensible failure. The system that had defeated Napoleon, conquered India and cowed the world, had been shattered, not by a great European army, but by a handful of farmers. The Redcoat, the very symbol of invincibility, was suddenly a mark of vulnerability. The army, shocked and humiliated, was forced into a painful period of introspection. The old articles of faith were now quite literally dead, but to truly understand the shock of its failure, we must first fully appreciate the sheer, unadulterated terror its success had inspired for 2 centuries. The Redcoat was a psychological weapon long before it was a tactical liability. Its power was not in the colour itself, but in the system it represented. It was the face of a new, industrialised and inhuman form of warfare. To face a British line in battle was to face something that seemed to defy human nature. Imagine being a French conscript at Waterloo, or a Maratha warrior at Assaye. You are waiting, your heart pounding, as the British line appears, a long, ruler-straight line of red. They do not run, they do not shout, they simply advance. They move at a steady, relentless 75 paces per minute. Their white crossbelts a stark X on their chests, their bayonets glistening. The sound is not a chaotic roar, but the steady, hypnotic thump, thump, thump of thousands of boots on the earth, punctuated by the sharp rattle of the snare drums. Then, your artillery opens fire. A cannonball, a 9-pound sphere of solid iron, smashes into the red line. You see it strike, see it tear a grotesque 10-foot wide hole in the formation, a spray of red cloth, white belts, and human ruin. But the line does not stop. It does not waver. The men on either side of the gap, their faces blank and smeared with soot, simply take 1 pace sideways, dressing the line, filling the hole as if it never existed. The thump, thump, thump of the advance continues, unbroken. This was the true horror. The Redcoats were not a collection of men. They were a machine, a relentless, red-toothed harvester that did not feel pain, did not know fear, and could not be stopped. Then, the machine would halt, 50 yards away, close enough to see the hard, set eyes under their shakos. A moment of agonizing silence. Then, a single, deafening, unified crash. The volley. It was not a rattle of individual shots, but a single, concussive explosion, a solid wall of lead that tore your own front rank to pieces, and in the acrid, choking white-grey smoke that instantly obscured them, you hear the order, charge. Through that smoke, the red machine would re-emerge, but now it was a thing of animalistic fury, a screaming, bayonet-tipped wave of red running at you. This combination, the inhuman mechanical advance, the shocking point-blank volley, and the immediate brutal bayonet charge, was a three-act play of terror. It was designed to break not the enemy's line, but his will, and the uniform itself played a final, grim role. The heavy wool and the Venetian red dye were notoriously good at masking the sight of blood. A man could be shot, even badly wounded, and the red cloth would simply turn a darker shade of crimson. In the chaos of battle, his comrades would not see the spreading stain, not see the visual proof of their own vulnerability. It was a small, gruesome detail that helped maintain the illusion of invincibility, preventing the visual cues that spark panic. The red coat was the uniform of an army that had engineered fear itself into a weapon. The shock of Majuba Hill was profound because it proved that the redcoat's psychological power had been rendered irrelevant. A man you can't see cannot be intimidated. The Boers, hidden, camouflaged, and firing from 500 yards, were immune to the terrible advance of the Red Line. They were not fighting a psychological war. They were conducting a long-range execution. The British Army, for the first time in its modern history, was faced with a choice: adapt or become extinct. The solution, the new uniform that would replace the red coat, did not come from a committee in London or a high command directive. It came, as so many British imperial innovations had, from the field. It came from India. For decades, British regulars stationed on the dusty, sun-scorched plains of the Indian subcontinent had found their formal uniforms to be a torment. The heavy wool red coats were suffocatingly hot, and the white tropical duty uniforms were a brilliant, gleaming target that were impossible to keep clean. Practical-minded soldiers and their officers, far from the parade ground rigidity of Aldershot, began to improvise. They took their white uniforms and deliberately stained them. They used whatever came to hand: mud, curry powder, tea leaves, tobacco juice. The goal was simple: make the uniform blend in with the landscape. The local word for this dusty, earth-toned colour was khaki. This was not a uniform. It was a tactic. It was the birth of modern camouflage. Visionary officers, like Sir Harry Lumsden, who raised the Corps of Guides on the northwest frontier in 1846, had already adopted it. His men were dressed entirely in this drab, dusty colour, designed to make them invisible in the rocky hills. This was a philosophy of war completely alien to the one practiced in Europe. The red coat was designed to be seen, by generals for command and by enemies for terror. It was about visibility. Khaki was designed for invisibility. The red coat was the symbol of the disciplined line, the massed volley. Khaki was the tool of the individual skirmisher, the marksman, the hunter. The high command in London, however, was deeply resistant. To them, khaki was not a uniform. It was stain. It looked slobby, unprofessional, and dangerously native. The red coat was the symbol of the British soldier, the heritage of Blenheim, Quebec, and Waterloo. To abandon it was, to them, to abandon the very esprit de corps that had made the army great. They saw red as the colour of discipline and khaki as the colour of chaos. This institutional arrogance would cost thousands of lives. When the Second Boer War broke out in 1899, the British Army, despite the lesson of Majuba Hill nearly 20 years earlier, was still, in large part, an army of the 19th century. Many troops arrived still wearing their red coats for formal duties, and their field uniforms were often dark blue or green, colours almost as conspicuous as red against the pale South African veld. The Boers, once again, were clad in their drab civilian clothes, masters of camouflage, and now armed with even better rifles, the smokeless 5-shot Mauser. The opening battles were a horrific repeat of Majuba, but on a massive scale. At battles like Colenso and Spion Kop, the British, advancing in dense formations and clear, visible uniforms, were systematically slaughtered by invisible Boer marksmen. The casualty lists were staggering. The public was horrified. The army was broken. This time, the lesson could not be ignored. The red coat was a death sentence. By 1902, the change was made absolute and universal. Khaki was officially adopted as the sole uniform for active service. The red coat was permanently relegated to the parade ground, a ceremonial relic. This was not a change in fashion. It was the death certificate for an entire philosophy of warfare. The age of the line battalion was over. The age of the individual rifleman had begun. The red coat was now officially a ghost. The redcoat's 200-year reign was over. Born in the fire of the English Civil War, it was a creature of pragmatism. Its madder red dye was a matter of economics. Its standardization a matter of industrial-scale control for Machi, Cromwell's new model army. It was a tool, not yet a weapon. It was Marlborough who first forged it into one, combining its disciplined formations with the socket bayonet and the relentless volley fire that shattered the lines at Blenheim. It was Wolfe who perfected its offensive shock, his thin red line, conquering a continent with a single point-blank volley at Quebec. And it was Wellington who turned it into an unbreakable defensive system, mastering the frame, reverse slope, to protect it and the Ad infantry square, to make it impervious, defeating the god of war himself in the mud of Waterloo. For 2 centuries, it was the most dominant military system on earth. It was a psychological weapon, a red wave of terror built on the inhuman, mechanical discipline of the men who wore it. It was an instrument of command and control, a beacon of identity in the thick, choking, white-grey smoke of the black powder battlefield. The very things that made it a perfect weapon for its time were the exact things that ensured its demise. The system was rigid and technology is fluid. The Enfield rifle musket extended its killing range, but the doctrine remained fatally unchanged. The Poitiers breech loader and Pot smokeless powder stole its smokescreen, and the guerrilla tactics offered no lines to smash. At Sioux, Majuba Hill, the red coat was exposed for what it had become, a relic, a bright, conspicuous target from a bygone era. Its death and its replacement by the colour of dust. Khaki was not just a change of uniform. It was the end of an entire chapter of human conflict. It was the close of the age of linear warfare, of disciplined mass formations and the shock of the bayonet charge, and the bloody birth of the 20th century, the age of the sniper, the machine gun, and the invisible, camouflaged soldier. Today, the red coat lives on. It is a ghost, a ceremonial echo seen on the parade grounds of London, a flash of scarlet in a museum display. But it is more than a piece of wool. It is a symbol of a 2-century dominion, an emblem of an empire built on disciplined firepower. It represents both the peak of industrial warfare and the fatal arrogance of an institution that believed its own legend, an arrogance that finally, tragically, shattered against the rocks of a lonely hill in South Africa. It was not just a uniform, it was a system, it was a psychological weapon, and in the end, it was a tomb. Thanks for watching. If you found this story fascinating, please hit the like button, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in the comments. We'll see you in the next video.